Life has a way of unraveling in ways you never expect. You start with a vision, dreams of the perfect life, the right choices, the right partner, and for a while, it feels like you're on the right path. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the road shifts. The dreams blur, and before you know it, you're standing in the middle of a life that feels unrecognizable. That's where my story begins. His name was James. We met when I was 22, fresh out of nursing school and brimming with optimism. He worked as a mechanic at a garage near my apartment, and I wasn't looking for love then. I was focused on building my career, proving myself. But James had a quiet confidence, a warmth that felt like a balm to my nerves. He didn't try to impress me with big gestures. He was just James, and that was enough to draw me in. Those early days with him were like a montage from a romantic movie. He'd surprise me at work with my favorite turkey on rice sandwich, extra pickles every single time. I'd slip silly notes into his toolbox, little scribbles that said things like, "You're my favorite part of today." We'd laugh until our cheeks hurt, spend nights wrapped in each other's arms, and walk hand in hand as if the world existed just for us. It was passionate, raw, and real. When he proposed under the shade of an oak tree in the park, I didn't hesitate. Marrying him felt like winning life's lottery. For a while, our life together was blissful. We moved into a modest house with a creaky front porch and a swing, a house we'd dreamt of filling with children someday. James worked long hours at the garage, and I picked up night shifts at the hospital. We didn't have much, but it felt like we had everything. He was my anchor, my safe harbor, and I thought nothing could ever shake us. But life, as it does, has a way of eroding even the strongest foundations. The long hours turned into endless weeks, and the weight of responsibilities began to chip away at the magic we'd once shared. James came home exhausted, his face lined with stress and weariness. He'd sink onto the couch, barely acknowledging me before falling asleep. The playful spark that once lit up his eyes had dulled, and our conversations dwindled to the bare essentials: bills, groceries, schedules. At first, I thought it was just a rough patch. This is normal, I told myself. Everyone goes through it. We'll find our way back. But the small cracks turned into chasms. He stopped surprising me at work. The notes I left in his toolbox went unnoticed. Nights in bed became lonely rituals, with James falling asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. And when we did come together, it felt mechanical, rushed, like a task to check off rather than an act of love. 2 minutes, maybe less. I'd lie there afterward, staring at the ceiling, wondering where we'd gone wrong. The loneliness was unbearable. One Tuesday night, after James had dozed off on the couch again, I sat alone in our bed and felt the weight of it all crash down. The tears came, unbidden and unstoppable. I wanted to wake him, to shake him, to scream, "Don't you see me? Don't you care?" But I didn't. I turned off the light, buried my face in the pillow, and cried myself to sleep. No one warns you about the loneliness that can creep into a marriage. You're supposed to be a team, but what happens when one of you stops showing up? What happens when the person who was once your everything becomes just another figure in the background? I told myself to hold on, to be patient, to believe that love was about sacrifice. But deep down, I was starving. Starving for connection, for intimacy, for someone to remind me that I was still alive, still desirable, still worth something. And that's when David came into my life. He wasn't what you'd expect, not a doctor, not a patient, just one of the IT guys sent to fix a network issue at the hospital. I barely noticed him at first. He was polite, unassuming, just another face in the crowd. But one day, as I stood at the nurse's station, drowning in exhaustion, he struck up a conversation. "You look like you've had a long day," he said with a crooked smile, his voice cutting through the hum of monitors and beeping machines. I laughed lightly, more out of politeness than anything. "That obvious, huh?" "Just a little," he replied. "But I hear caffeine works wonders." Over the next few weeks, David seemed to appear everywhere: the cafeteria, the elevator, even outside on my smoke break, and I didn't even smoke. He had a way of making small talk feel significant, like he genuinely cared about the mundane details of my day. It started innocently enough, a shared laugh here, a cup of coffee there. But it didn't stay innocent for long. David remembered how I took my coffee, black, with a splash of cream. He asked about my night shifts, listened to my rants about difficult patients, and always managed to make me smile, even on my worst days. For the first time in years, I felt seen. And that scared me. I tried to create distance. I stopped eating in the cafeteria and took my breaks in my car. I avoided the staff lounge, opting for the stairwell instead of the elevator. But no matter how hard I tried to pull away, David always found a way to slip through the cracks. "You're avoiding me," he said one day, catching me in the hallway after I'd hurried past him for the third time that week. Did I do something wrong? No, I stammered, avoiding his gaze. I need some space. His brow furrowed, and for a moment, he looked genuinely hurt. If I've overstepped, I'm sorry. I just like talking to you. That's all. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could just be friends, that this connection didn't have to mean anything more. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was already in too deep. The first time it happened, it felt like an accident. We were both working late, the hospital eerily quiet. I was in the lounge, buried in paperwork when David walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and sat down across from me. "You look tired," he said softly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. For a while, we just sat there in silence. Then, out of nowhere, he reached across the table and took my hand in his. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything, to stop what was happening. But I didn't. I let him hold my hand, let his warmth seep into me, filling a void I hadn't even realized was there. "It doesn't have to mean anything," he said, as if reading my mind. Sometimes people just need someone to lean on. But it did mean something. It meant everything. Coming home to James felt like stepping into a house of mirrors, where everything seemed familiar but distorted. Each time I kissed him goodnight, the weight of my actions bore down on me like an anchor. James didn't deserve this. He was a good man, steady, kind, and loyal. The kind of man who had spent years trying to carry the weight of our shared life, even when cracks began to form. But that realization didn't absolve me. If anything, it deepened my sense of failure. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the wife he deserved. I tried to convince myself otherwise. I told myself that James had failed me first, that he was the one who had let the intimacy slip away, let the spark between us fade into a dull ember. But deep down, I knew the truth was far more complicated. He was doing his best, even if his best wasn't what I needed anymore. One night, lying in bed beside him as he snored softly, I felt the enormity of my betrayal crush me. I stared at the ceiling and, for the first time in years, prayed. I prayed for clarity, for strength, and for some kind of divine intervention to save me from myself. But mostly, I prayed for James. I prayed that he could find his way back to the man he used to be, the man I fell in love with. Because the truth was, I didn't want to be this person, a woman who lied to her husband, who betrayed him in the worst way possible. I wanted to fix what was broken, but I had no idea how. So, I did what I always did. I pretended. I pretended that everything was fine, that I was still the loving, faithful wife James thought I was. I hoped, prayed, that if I faked it long enough, things would eventually go back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The cracks in our marriage had grown too wide, and I wasn't sure if they could ever be mended. The night it finally happened wasn't premeditated, at least not consciously. But if I'm being honest, some part of me knew it was coming. You don't play with fire and expect not to get burned. David and I had been tiptoeing around the line for weeks. The stolen glances, the lingering touches, the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the room, it all led up to this moment. And I let it. I wanted it. It was a Friday night after a grueling double shift at the hospital. My body ached, and my mind was clouded with fatigue. As I walked to the parking lot, there he was, leaning casually against his car with that warm, confident smile that always seemed to make my heart stutter. "You look exhausted," he said as I approached. "Long day," I replied, my voice heavy. "Come on," he said, opening the passenger door. "Let me take you out for a drink. You need to unwind." For a moment, I hesitated, torn between the life I knew and the temptations standing before me. But the thought of going home to another night of James asleep on the couch, of lying in bed feeling invisible, was too much to bear. "Okay," I said softly, climbing into his car. We ended up at a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where no one would recognize us, where the dim lighting and low hum of conversation created a cocoon of anonymity. Over the next couple of hours, we talked and laughed, the tension between us simmering just beneath the surface. I could feel it in the way his hand brushed against mine when he reached for his drink, in the way his eyes lingered on my lips when I spoke. By the time we left, the wine and his presence had created a heady cocktail of desire and recklessness. Standing by his car in the cool night air, I found myself saying words I never thought I'd hear coming out of my mouth. "I don't want to go home yet." His eyes softened, his voice low and inviting. "Then don't." We drove to a nearby hotel, the silence between us thick with anticipation. My heart pounded as we walked into the room, my body trembling with a mix of fear and exhilaration. I had never done anything like this before. I had never cheated on my husband. But in that moment, all I could think about was how much I needed him. David didn't rush. He took his time, his hands and lips exploring me like I was something to be cherished. For the first time in years, I felt beautiful, desired, alive. When we finally came together, it was everything I had been craving and more. He touched parts of me, physically and emotionally, that had long been neglected. I felt a satisfaction I hadn't known in years, a fleeting escape from the emptiness that had consumed my marriage. Afterward, as we lay tangled in the sheets, reality began to seep back in. Relief, guilt, and sadness crashed over me in waves. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and while part of me regretted it, another part felt like I had reclaimed a piece of myself I thought was lost. "You deserve to be happy," David said softly, his fingers tracing circles on my shoulder. I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I deserve anymore." When I finally made it home that night, James was asleep on the couch, the glow of the television flickering across his face. I stood there for a moment, my chest tightening with guilt. He looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm I had unleashed. I wanted to wake him, to confess everything, to beg him to fight for us. But I couldn't. I didn't have the courage to face the consequences of my actions. Instead, I kissed his forehead and whispered, "I love you," even though I wasn't sure if it was still true. The next morning, James woke up early and made me breakfast. He didn't ask where I had been the night before or why I had come to bed so late. He just handed me a plate of scrambled eggs and toast and kissed me on the cheek like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And I wasn't sure if I could ever put the pieces back together. It's strange how guilt can become both your prison and your only relief. After everything, I thought I could hold on, that I could bury my mistakes deep enough that they would never resurface. But the cracks in my life were too deep, and no amount of effort could patch them. James had always been a kind man, a good man. He didn't deserve what I had done to him. And yet, as I sat across from him during dinner, his head bent over his plate, his smile softer now, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the distance between us. It was no longer just physical. It was the silent gap of secrets, of feelings I couldn't fully express, and of the mistakes that had built a chasm too wide to bridge. Since ending things with David, I had tried to pour every ounce of myself back into our marriage. I cooked the healthiest meals I could, spent hours planning date nights, and walked miles with James after dinner, holding his hand even when it felt mechanical. The man I had married, the one who had stood beside me through thick and thin, deserved nothing less than my best effort. But no matter how hard I tried, something always felt incomplete. James had been going to the doctor regularly now. The medication was helping, albeit slowly. Where he had once avoided the bedroom entirely, now he tried. He kissed me more, pulled me closer at night, and held my hand with a tenderness that made my chest ache with guilt. "We'll get there," he said one night, his voice filled with a hope that I no longer shared. "Of course," I replied, stroking his hair as he rested his head against my shoulder. But in the quiet moments, when the house was dark and the world felt still, I would find myself staring at the ceiling, wondering, wondering if we could truly get back what we had lost, wondering if I could ever stop thinking about David, and wondering if I would ever forgive myself. David had been my escape, my refuge from the monotony and loneliness that had consumed me for years. He had shown me that I could still feel alive, still feel wanted, and for a time, that had been enough. But the cost of that escape had been too high. I'd traded my integrity for fleeting moments of passion, and now I was left to carry the weight of that decision. James, oblivious to the storm raging inside me, continued to try. He came to bed earlier, kissed me with more intention, and told me every day that he loved me. And I loved him too. That was the hardest part. I loved him in a way that felt almost maternal now, a protective love born from years of shared history and unspoken understanding. But the spark, the fire that had once burned so brightly between us, had long since dimmed. I'd stopped praying, stopped hoping for some divine intervention to save us. Instead, I focused on the day-to-day, trying to rebuild a life that felt increasingly fragile. But the questions I refused to ask aloud haunted me in the quiet moments. How long could I keep this up? How long could I pretend that everything was fine when the emptiness inside me refused to fade? The final straw came on a rainy Thursday evening. James had surprised me with a bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers. He handed them to me with a sheepish grin, his cheeks flushed like a boy on his first date. "I thought these might cheer you up," he said. I took the flowers, forcing a smile as I leaned in to kiss his cheek. "They're beautiful," I said, though my voice felt hollow. That night, as I arranged the daisies in a vase, I felt the tears begin to fall. Silent, steady tears that I couldn't control. I turned my back to James, hiding my face as he sat on the couch, oblivious to my unraveling. The truth was, the daisies only reminded me of the woman I used to be, the woman who had believed in forever, and who had thought that love would be enough to conquer anything. When I climbed into bed that night, James was already asleep. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about David, about the way he had made me feel, about the words he had whispered in the darkness of those stolen nights. "You deserve to be happy," he had said, and for a time, I had believed him. But happiness, I realized now, wasn't something that could be stolen or borrowed. It had to be built, brick by brick, day by day. And I wasn't sure if I had the strength to rebuild. The next morning, I woke up to find James in the kitchen, making pancakes. He grinned when he saw me, flipping a golden brown pancake onto a plate. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "I thought I'd make us breakfast." I watched him for a moment, my heart aching with a mixture of love and regret. "You didn't have to do that," I said, my voice soft. "I wanted to," he replied, his smile unwavering. As we sat down to eat, I realized that this was the life I had chosen. This was the man I had promised to love and cherish, for better or worse. And no matter how much I had strayed, no matter how far I had fallen, I owed it to him to try. I didn't know if we could ever fully heal, if the cracks in our marriage could ever truly be mended. But as I reached across the table to take his hand, I decided that I would keep trying. For James. For us. And maybe, just maybe, for myself. Because love, even when it's imperfect, is still worth fighting for.